Great. I think we can start now. It's exactly 4:01 or 1600 hours EAT in Nairobi. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this lovely Thursday or February edition of Last Thursdays. My name is Felshia Chiang, and I'm a senior associate for the Insights Hub, what we like to call a think tank. And I'm also responsible for product development at Development Dynamics. And I'm just going to take us shortly through who we are and what Last Thursdays is about. But before I do that, I would like to invite us to share where we're joining from, an emoji representing how you're feeling today, and one expectation we have for this edition of Last Thursdays. And we can do that in the chats as I just introduce us and what this edition of Last Thursdays is about. Now, onto who we are. Development Dynamics is a premier Pan-African think tank, do tank, and through tank dedicated to unlocking the next generation of innovation, investment, and impact. And we do this by collaborating with investors, investees, and intermediaries to reframe, reimagine, and resolve complex, intersectional, and urgent issues in the development, philanthropy, and social impact ecosystem. Now, our work would be remiss of so much if it wasn't rooted in the fusion of design thinking, systems practice, and strategic foresight. And that is what we call our cohesive framework that enables us to co-create sustainable and equitable solutions that drive meaningful change across Africa and beyond. Now, this triple play approach ensures that our solutions are holistic, innovative, and future fit. And this is because we're able to empathize deeply with our user needs, with our users and their needs to create functional and human-centered solutions, because we talk a lot about human-centered design. We analyze complex systems to understand the interconnectedness of social and business landscapes, and we anticipate future challenges and design adaptable, resilient interventions. You'll hear Dr. Maxi talk a lot about strategic foresight. And if you hadn't noticed by now, we speak and exist in threes, which is our magic number. And so as a think tank, or what we call the Insights Hub, we bridge knowledge gaps by conducting research and analysis for governments, NGOs, communities, and the private sector. And we facilitate knowledge exchange through dialogue and regular ecosystem convenings, ensuring that our insights are shared and actionable. And secondly, as a do tank, we deliver tailored strategy design, impact measurement, and community building services. And this empower leaders and practitioners to amplify movements and accelerate their impact effectively. And third, which is last but not least, as a through tank or our investment catalyst, we partner with funders and grantees to maximize the impact of every investment. And this includes streamlining access through grant and fund management, preparing organizations for investment via incubation and investor readiness, and shifting power and resources to local actors for more equitable and sustainable outcomes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, part of our mandate as a think tank is just to ensure that we facilitate knowledge exchange through dialogue and regular ecosystem convenings. And this is why Last Thursdays exists. It is one of the products or avenues that seeks to accomplish this. And more concretely, Last Thursdays is a monthly convening designed to encourage peer-to-peer learning, collaboration, and innovative thinking within the development and innovation landscape. As the name rightfully implies, every last Thursdays of the month, we religiously bring together thought leaders, practitioners, and enthusiasts, just like you all who are gathered here today, to discuss a wide range of topics shaping today's social impact and development sector. And we have previously convened a number of sessions throughout last year and now getting into this year on movement building, on impact measurement, on systems practice, which is our most recent topic and which is what we're continuing to do today. And this edition of Last Thursdays is the third of a series we began last year on systems practice for social impact in collaboration with Food for the Hungry Kenya. And I will invite Mutile to take us through a recap of what these sessions have been about, as well as just segue us into today's pertinent conversation. Welcome, Mutile.
Thank you, Felshia, and it's lovely to see you all. So Fajr has mentioned that for the past 2 months or so, we've been talking about systems practice, and how it can help us in our social impact work. And just the idea that in a forest, there are trees, there are roots at the bottom of the trees, there is a canopy, and just this practice of seeing the forest and the trees and all the interconnections that exist within it. And so in the first session, we focused a bit on the key concepts in systems thinking, concepts like interconnectedness, complex and wicked issues, and just understanding that mindsets and mental models are vital parts of how we see the world and how we interact with everything that is around us. We talked a little bit about how diagnosing the type of issues we face is what really helps us to understand and to have the proper approach to dealing with issues, because we know how complex that social and environmental issues are. And yet at the same time, not every issue would require a system. So through that process, we dealt a little bit into the cake, rocket, and child tool. This is a tool that helps us to understand the different levels of complexity of problems. And as you can see on the screen, we identified 4 levels of problems: simple, complicated, complex, and wicked or highly complex. We also talked a little bit about the iceberg model in the second episode on systems practice. And the iceberg model is basically a framework that helps us to understand how things interact within a system. And you can see here at the very top, there are 4 levels. There's events at the very top, patterns or trends, underlying structures, and then mental models at the very bottom. And if you think about the current situation we're facing, and if we try to apply this to the situation, you would see that at the top of the iceberg, the event we're dealing with right now is funding disruptions. A lot of global north or large funders are pulling out of their funding structures. And then we can try and figure out what lies at the very bottom of this iceberg. So that's kind of the conversation that we're hoping to have today, to figure out what exactly is the funding ecosystem that we're in as investors, investees, and intermediaries, and how do we make changes that allow African countries to regain sovereignty and agency so that the work that we're doing as social impact practitioners does not stop when funding is so easily seemingly snatched away. And just for a bit of context for today's discussion, I just wanted to put a few numbers here. We can see that there's over 230 billion US dollars of aid in 2023. 10.3% of this went to the health sector, and 13.7% of it went to the humanitarian sector. Of the total 233 billion, 26.8% went to Africa. That's over a quarter of the whole amount of global aid. And yet this is still insufficient. So there really is a need for us to understand what this situation is and how we can improve our position in this state. And so at Development Dynamics, Fetch has mentioned that part of our work is to bring ecosystem people together. And the idea behind this is really to democratize information, to break down silos and barriers, and enable the people who are working in this space to get to a sort of level of, sorry, I see people saying my volume is low. Apologies for that. So as I was mentioning, at Development Dynamics, we convene ecosystem actors together. And for this, we brought together a database that is open access and is crowdsourced. And we hope to get your insights and input into this. It will be posted in the chat very shortly, and you'll see what it looks like. We have 4 tabs in this accessible Google Sheet. The first tab is where we have information about the database. The second tab is where we have the community database, where we hope to collate information about who is actually present within the sector and what their area of focus is. And then the third tab in the Google Sheet is for opportunities, just being cognizant of how these disruptions have left people without jobs, have put people on unpaid leave. We just thought it would be nice to bring together some opportunities for the people that we know and work very closely with. And then the fourth tab is for resources around the sector and the work we're doing. There's a lot of news coming out. There are lots of articles that are really analyzing and digging deep into what this sector looks like. And so we thought it would be nice to bring those resources together. So the idea is really for this to be crowdsourced. You all have access to it. It's community owned and it is for the community. So we invite you to fill this in with as much information as you have. And we hope that it would be of benefit to everyone who is participating here and even those who are not in the room today. If you think that there would be something useful for them, please do feel free to share it with them. And with that, I'm happy to hand over to the next speaker, Nicholas.
Thank you so much. Yes, sorry. Thank you so much, Tile, and welcome everyone. I'd like to just go through the charts quickly and welcome everyone. I can see we have teams from Washington, we can have teams from Kenya, we have teams from Scotland, we have teams from Joburg, SA, we have teams from Harare, Rwanda. I've seen we've had teams from Zimbabwe, and I've seen also we've had our partners and our various speakers are also on board. I can see we have teams from Germany also on board, and generally, I can see also from Tunisia, we have a team. We have a team from Oxford also, and teams from Tennessee. So yes, Nashville, welcome everyone to today's discussion, and thank you for keeping time. Thank you for joining us. And as our first speaker, Felicia, had shared, please just take the time, go to the chat space, let us know where you're coming from, how we can engage, and so that we can know each other as we proceed. So my name's Nicholas Mokon. I am the senior associate here at Development Dynamics, dealing or leading the unit for business expansion and advisory services. And we'll be going through today's findings for the rapid assessment survey. So we did this survey in partnership with the East African Network. And the basis or the genesis of this is that on January 27th of 2025, which is this year, we launched this assessment in response to a very rapidly evolving landscape of funding disruptions. As we are all aware, as we are, I believe we're all aware, that we witnessed an unprecedented shift in donor priorities, particularly with the US funding, where in the first month of the year of 2025, there was a US freeze order that has now generally escalated to a more closer to USAID office. And it's really created a state of uncertainty. And this has had a ripple effect where we have seen countries and governments such as the Switzerland government, the German and the Canadian governments following suit in reducing their aids contribution to African development organizations. And if you remember what Mutili has just shared in the numbers, you can see how big of a shift and a disruption this causes. But next slide. Next slide. So these disruptions have led to far-reaching consequences for the general development sector, with many organizations struggling to adapt as the global funding landscape continues to be influenced by a complex web of factors ranging from geopolitical shifts and macro fluctuations to climate crisis and conflict development amongst organizations. This dynamic environment, which some experts are referring to as a polycrisis, challenges traditional funding models and highlights the vulnerability of organizations that really heavily depend on donor funding. So in our survey, what were the key objectives that we wanted to bring out? So it's heavily to assess the importance of the immediate impacts of the USAID funding, and this at this point also brings the other countries that I've mentioned in the government to see how does this disruption in funding, what does it cause? to analyze organizations' resilience and adaptation strategies, to identify key support needs for these organizations, and examine the sector-specific vulnerabilities and best practices that would lead to adaptability. And lastly, facilitate collective action to strengthen the development ecosystem in Africa. So this survey captured the voices of over 237 organizations, and these organizations ranged from Kenya to Uganda to Tanzania, Togo, Niger, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Egypt, DRC, and Somalia. And all these represented the organizations at different levels. Some organizations leading multi-country operations, others leading regional operations. And these organizations are gripping with a new era of unpredictability, which has led to staff layoff, halted programs, and in some cases, the closure of vital services, as we know that it has affected various sectors. Next slide. So these sectors, for example, include education, healthcare, climate, human rights, advocacy. It's a very long range of different sectors that have been heavily influenced and impacted. But what's worth noting is that it's the education sector, the health sector, and the livelihood sectors, which were the top three sectors that have been heavily hit by this current state of affairs, and are the ones who are currently facing the biggest challenges. Right? And that's a breakdown of the sectors as per their rankings. So what does this mean? So a major takeaway that we have captured in all of this is that 42.5 of the respondents said that the donor space has become very unpredictable, and that is very hard to plan for sustainability. So, out of this also, we said almost 75% of organizations reported moderate to severe disruptions, with many facing fiscal jeopardy. In fact, 21% of organizations are at risk of losing 75 to 90% of their budgets, which leads to a ripple effect of staff layoff, program halting, and service disruption. Next slide. So while the challenges are severe, there is hope. There are lessons that we're learning. So the resilience demonstrated by some organizations is encouraging, where around 34% of respondents indicated strong confidence in their ability to pivot and adapt. And I think that is something that is worth noting, that even in this space, in this situation, this time, 34% of the total respondents were actually confident in this space. And with the reports that you will soon get access to, those who were from fairly confident, neutral, and very confident actually turned out to be 60% of the total respondents. And this is a very heartwarming space to be at, in that there are things that we can do to adapt, but the first attitude change towards it and feeling is that we can still adapt and pivot throughout this stage. When it comes to budget cuts versus impact on mission, so as we'll go through the presentation and the report, we use two correlation indicators, which was the Pearson correlation coefficient and the Spearman rank correlation. These two matrices help us draw correlations between two data points, which allows to draw a straight line and see the different outliers and see if there is a positive or a negative correlation to data sets. And when you have a correlation that is from 0 to 1, that is a positive moderate correlation, which means that there is direct synthesis or direct influence. And if it's negative, then it means that there is no direct influence or synthesis. So by using these two matrices, you see that there's a 0.42 and a 0.45 correlation, which is moderately positively strong. that the budget cuts has actually impacted in mission and mission implementation abilities. And this is heavily seen again in the healthcare and climate space, which leads to heightened vulnerability in these spaces. Next slide. The same with support, type preference, and organizational resilience. There was a moderate positive relation that links capacity building, strategic foresight, and leadership development as sustainable, as a way to build sustainability and resilience in various organizations and their structures, which was demonstrated through the voices that we captured in the text. And I'd like to just go through one of our respondent voices who said, strategic review, planning, and forecasting alongside enhanced fundraising capability as critical to strengthening our resilience and continued delivery on our mission. This is also captured more in our report, as we'll be sharing. Next slide. Next slide. So I want to go to the slide that has questions that questions that we would want to pose to each other as we go through, and as I end up handing over to our next speaker. For investors, and investors are anyone who funds or has the money to fund initiatives, would like to ask the questions: how can investors integrate more flexible funding models to allow organizations to pivot in response to financial uncertainty? Or how can we systemically assess the risk exposure of our grantees operating in politically unstable or economic fragile environments to tailor funding strategies accordingly? And this is, like, for example, seen heavily in South Sudan, DRC, and other parts of the country and our continent. Next slide. When it comes to our investees, who are those who receive from the investors, it will be, what steps can the organization take to reduce our over-reliance on a single source donor funding and explore attractive alternate revenue models? Or how can our organizations build adaptive governance structures that enable quick decision-making during financial uncertainty? All about adaptability and revenue diversity. And lastly, to our intermediaries, who are those people who work or are forming between the space of our investees and investors. How can you promote cross-sectional collaboration to strengthen the collective resilience of players during a disruption? What strategies can we use to expand and deepen networks to create more meaningful strategy partnerships for investees and investors? And how can intermediaries ensure that the type of support provided, whether financial, technical, or strategic, are generally aligned with the evolving needs of investors and investees? These are just questions, as I now welcome our next speaker, who's Awar, that are to provoke us in this space to think through the next steps. The study was not to give recommendations, but to lead to sector provoking, where we can see and ask the tough questions that we need to start addressing. And with that, the actual report is out, and part of the chat spaces will be able to see the report, and I believe a link will be shared. But also, we want to really thank the East African Philanthropy Network, for they were our collaborators in this process. And I know we have Mr. Evans and Purity, who are from the East African Philanthropy Network, who are on board, and they did support us a lot in mobilization and helping us think through this data and how we're going to present it. So you will be able to find this report on both platforms, the Development Dynamics platform and the East African Philanthropy Network platforms. And with that, I'd like to welcome Awar, who will be our next speaker and taking us through a landscape analysis of the PPPP framework. Welcome, Awar.
Thank you, Nicholas. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see everyone being part of this conversation. I hope you can hear me. Just a quick thumbs up if you can, so that I can get into just a very, very quick summary of what the landscape analysis for the PPPP framework is. Okay, so we are mostly familiar with the PPP framework, which is public-private partnerships. And these have been mostly driven by government, private entities to be able to further development. And there are different forms of PPPs, which we're not going to get into at this time. However, what we found is that there has always been that missing link between private-public partnerships and the inclusion of philanthropy within that nomenclature. So with that in mind, what a good well-rounded PPPP framework would do is essentially enhance the opportunities for development, but from a more human-centered lens. And that is the opportunity that we are confronted with the development of a PPPP framework. But of course, it's important to start from the first 3 Ps. And these have been a vehicle of infrastructure development since in ancient civilizations. So there are different aspects within which this has manifested, and you'll be able to read more on this within the analysis. But up until the 21st century, they have come in different forms, whether it is through agriculture, in taxation and revenue, and most prominently in infrastructure development projects. Now, philanthropy's contributions have mostly been seen as a measure for social good. But in the inclusion of philanthropy in a PPPP framework, it is now integrating what we've always looked at in terms of the SDGs, which is with the goal to leave no one behind. So as we get into the need of adding philanthropy into that nomenclature, I'll just unpack a couple of policy enablers that have allowed PPPs to thrive within the continent. So there has been good political will to include private actors in development projects. And this has been the case since independence in our societies, at least in the modern African societies. There have been different enablers of this. We have a World Bank, that the World Bank designed a PPP framework development guide that many countries have been working with. You find that this has been the guideline that has been used in countries like Peru. It has been used across the world, in South America and also here in Africa. So, and we also have a continental PPP framework and strategy that has 3 core pillars that look into making the development agenda more people-focused, more people-centered. However, none of these frameworks include philanthropy within that nomenclature. And when you find that in countries like Ethiopia, where they have a very well-integrated PPP framework that lives within the Ministry of Finance in its own directorate, and within that directorate, there are well-defined departments that help to focus on projects, whether it's infrastructure in energy, whether it's water, whether it's agriculture. So these different departments have a focus on that. So with the introduction of philanthropy into this ecosystem and into this landscape, we can be able to start to see, especially in contexts like that, where there has been a full integration and a complete understanding of how to fully integrate PPP work within the government infrastructure. The addition of philanthropy would also not be something new. Next slide, please. So the trends in PPP projects in Africa have shown that there have been a lot of partnerships, not only with local philanthropists, but also global philanthropists. So that is what we are familiar with. A very good example is the AIDS Alliance, where you find the governments, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, multilateral funding have come together towards finding a vaccine and a cure for HIV and AIDS. So this is one of the most prominent examples of PPPP projects that we have seen within the region. But we've seen that PPPP projects have also been mostly driven by external actors. And what that has caused is a focus on very few areas of interest and areas of work, specifically in agriculture, health, and education and infrastructure projects as well. But with the African philanthropists who come into PPPP collaborations, we found that there's been a steady growth since the year 2000. And what is most common is that they're able to support a broader base of issues because they have a better understanding of the local context. And therefore, it is much easier for them to be able to follow the intersectional lines where all these different issues meet. So with the PPPP framework that we are looking to develop, with EAP in partnership with EAPN, what we are seeing here is a real opportunity to create a utilization-focused PPPP framework that integrates not only what has worked within PPP projects within the region, but also integrating philanthropy and very, very important frameworks such as feminist leadership in ensuring that utilization focus and that human-centered focus. We will be making the landscape analysis available to you for you to read with, for you to interact with, and for you to give us our feedback as well in terms of what your reflections would be as we work towards building this regional PPPP framework that we hope will be able to ground more local and drive more local involvement of philanthropy in development. Thank you, and I will give my time to the next speaker. I'd like to invite Evans to speak more on this and on the work of EAPN in promoting philanthropy in development. Karibu, Evans.
I'm not sure Evans is connected just yet, but thank you. Thank you so much for the context that you have set. I will invite, Evans, you're here. I'll invite you shortly. Let me just segue to invite you to what is arguably the most critical, important conversation, undeniably a very timely conversation for our sector and for us all here in Africa. I'm sure you would agree. We really want to shift gears here instead of just reacting to the numbers that we are seeing, to the funding downturns that we are witnessing. We want to provocatively use this time to figure out where we can create some real and systemic change in how Africa approaches development going forward. I think I'd like to thank you, Nick and Award, for providing such a valuable context and setting the stage so well with the numbers, beyond the numbers, and also a possible regional quadruple P framework, which Evans will also speak about shortly. I think we all seen the political landscape in the US and in the EU change quite dramatically right in front of our eyes. As we've had, a couple more countries are following suit in how they approach development funding. It's no longer business as usual. It's not the traditional aid model that can work anymore. And when we think about it, we also seen the East really come up also, quote unquote, China, Arab world, take opportunity of this and also try to see where they can lean in to support, but also some of this support comes with some pretty tough business conditions and consequences. So as it were, right now, it's a dicey season for the development sector in Africa. And my heart and thoughts go out to those who are navigating these very uncertain moments. Lots of declarations, about work that you've been doing that's probably no longer relevant. The millions who depended on the generosity of the West, they no longer have a priority. Honestly, it feels like every single sector is affected. You name it: international trade, economy, health, education, food, wash, migration, security. We all have a real discussion coming up ahead with the panelists about how do we actually take actionable strategies and reframe partnerships. And to start us off, I know Evans is joining us from South Africa briefly this afternoon. And I'm sure, Evans, your phone has been buzzing since January 20th with many EAPN members asking for support. You can share the next slide, which has Evans. And I am sure a lot of people are probably asking, how do we just hang on to the sector with a bit of grace and a bit of humility? And EAPN has been a key player leading change in the philanthropic space within East Africa. Evans, even as you join us for a few minutes, what are the top 3 priority levers in African philanthropy that will help their impact investments and initiatives remain relevant in the midst of these funding shakeups? And as you think about that, also your second question, so that you can just address us as a collective, how is such a central network infrastructure entity like the East African Philanthropy Network, how are you leading the charge towards ecosystem level change with players from across the divide, across the private, public, and philanthropic sector? I'd welcome you to come onto the mic, to come onto the screen and engage us in that conversation. Evans?
Thank you so much, Maxi. Can I confirm that you can hear me?
Very loud and clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And what a timely conversation and what a timely opportunity for us to really deliberate on critical, practical, actionable steps that we can put in place as a sector, as key strategic stakeholders in this space to really move philanthropy, to really support the communities which are in dire need of investments and help to really have their lives move. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this conversation. And thank you so much to the team at DD and EAPN for putting this together. Maxi, allow me in just 2 minutes to give a brief about what we do as EAPN. We are a network of philanthropic organizations in East Africa. Our role is basically to unlock local philanthropy and to really build around local resource mobilization, local capital into the social justice space. We exist to build strategic alliances, and in specific, how we as a sector in philanthropy can work with the private sector, how we can work with the government, and how we can bring that tripartite, multi-stakeholders, multi-sectoral approach to work. In other words, we appreciate that philanthropy cannot work in isolation. We have to really tap into all the available opportunities to enable us tap and scale. And so EAPN exists to build those strategic alliances. We also exist as a network to really enhance the practice of philanthropy. We exist to strengthen our knowledge base, to build the critical data so that we can make informed decisions as a sector. We also exist to look into the legal policy infrastructure for philanthropy. We want to see an environment that enables giving, and we work very closely with the governments of the day across the region to really put in place an enabling environment for the growth of philanthropy. And of course, lastly, with good environment, with good alliances being built, with appropriate knowledge and data, we only miss and need to build strong institutions to enable that ecosystem to work in a manner that unlocks the potential that we have within this space. And so that is what we do as EAPN, 23 years old, and we appreciate the support that we've worked around these key strategic focus areas with you as stakeholders. Back to the question, Maxi, that you've put. We are living in extremely difficult times for most communities, but I want to look at it positively. And I want to look at it in terms of what is it that we can do? Because, you know, we saw this coming. I can tell you that 5 years ago, within one of our initiatives around futures and foresights, we had models that really showcased this happening. And so for us, we are looking at this as an opportunity. In the short time, it may be extremely devastating, but we are putting in place measures to really ensure that in the long term, this really becomes a blessing to this continent and the entire global South. And so the three things which I feel we can prioritize as African philanthropy to really help us in terms of impact investments and for us to remain relevant amidst the funding shakeups that we are seeing. One, I think it is a time for us to really transition from donor dependence to resilience. We've got to really look into locally led financial or rather financing models. When we are seeing the political shifts, the economic shifts, the donor priorities changing, I think we've got to now build a self-reliant financing model that not only overly relies on external sources, but really taps into the local domestic resources that we are talking about. And that's why the PPPP model that my colleagues at Development Dynamics are talking about really comes handy and really comes as a tool that we can leverage, a tool that can really enable us to tap into those local resources that we are talking about. While looking at that shift, we've got to really look into the emerging and existing innovative financing models, for example, blended finance. And we've got to really put in place structures that enable us to attract commercial capital without really compromising the mission that we are driving. I think we've also got to look into endowment models and revenue generating assets. For example, mission-related investments, MRIs, looking at the so that such can really help philanthropic institutions build long-term capital reserves, ensuring that we remain financially sustainable amidst the volatility that we are seeing currently. Number two, I think we've got to also reposition philanthropy as an enabler and not just a funder. Traditionally, we have seen philanthropy being a gap filler, addressing shortfalls in the funding when governments and businesses fall short. However, I think in the face of the funding contractions that we are seeing, we've got to position philanthropy to be a catalyst that unlocks systemic change. While still talking about that repositioning that we've got to look into, we've got to really move beyond grant giving to co-investing with governments and of course with the private sector. And that is why for us, the model that we are talking about really ensures that every dollar of philanthropic capital is leveraged for more significant impact. If we want to scale, then we've got to really work in a collaborative manner. And if we are to collaborate with the private sector and of course with the government, then co-investing becomes an option over and above, the grant giving that we have done so well in. While still unpacking that, I think philanthropy can help create an environment which really both the private sector and public capital can flow towards sustainable development initiatives. And we can do this by shaping policy conversations and really influencing the financial regulatory frameworks that we are currently working with. And so the nimbleness of philanthropy, the agility that we are having, and the flexibility that comes with our investments, I think we've got to really now look into how to invest in a proper legal policy infrastructure that enables us to give. Example includes, advocating for tax incentives, encouraging corporate giving, influencing procurement for policies to favor social enterprises, and impact-driven organizations. I think those are some of the opportunities that are existing. And of course, lastly, number three, because you asked for three, I think we've got to also look into how do we strengthen trust-based, how do we strengthen community-driven, and how do we strengthen locally driven solutions, to the social investment practices that we are looking at. So we have to shift from donor-driven philanthropy to locally led models. And so it's no longer ideological stance, but a strategic necessity. I think the organizations that are best positioned to create lasting change must have deep trust-based relationships with the communities that we are working with. And then lastly, we've got to look into local philanthropy infrastructure, including the African community foundations, including indigenous giving networks, including grassroots philanthropy initiatives. We have to strengthen them and really ensure that the resources that go to the grassroots really reach those that require it most. And so that infrastructure, that ecosystem really need to be built for us to leverage the opportunities that come with it. Philanthropy must actively participate in shaping policies that enable local giving, such as, revisiting tax structures to incentivize domestic philanthropy and ensure that local organizations have direct access to international funding, to mention the least. And then, Maxi, you asked in your question too around the central role that networks and infrastructure support entities like EAPN really need to play in terms of systemic shift, in terms of supporting the ecosystem, in terms of building private-public philanthropic engagements while looking at development as a whole. And I think one of them is to really look into how do we mobilize multi-sectoral partnerships for systems change? How do we build strategic alliances that really champion the issues that we are talking about? And so philanthropy alone cannot solve Africa's most pressing development challenges. We must work in alignment with the government. We must work in alignment with the private sector, and of course, the broader civil society without losing our identity as philanthropy. And so I think the other thing is, as EAPN, we have been at the forefront in terms of championing, as I mentioned earlier, private sector, philanthropy, civil society, government engagement. And this we are looking at really putting in place practical partnerships, practical collaborations that really ensure that we unlock domestic capital, that ensures that we unlock the potential that we are having locally and domestically within the region, and of course, talking on behalf of this continent. So I think EAPN, on the other hand, must play a critical role in convening diverse actors so that we ensure that philanthropy is embedded into the national and regional development strategies. And we have been working with the regional bodies. We have been working with a lot of entities from within the region, from within the nations where we work, to really build on that strategic alliances that we are talking about. So I think also EAPN, through such strategic convenings, for example, in June of this year, we'll be hosting the 9th East Africa Philanthropy Conference in Kigali, Rwanda. And we are looking at how do we build an agile philanthropy in the face of the economic, social, and political shifts that we are seeing? And I welcome all of you to join us. And Purity, if you don't mind, you can post in the link the registration and additional details about that conference. But at the national level, how do we leverage the national forums, the national philanthropy forums, to advance nation-specific issues that affect us as a region? How do we also leverage the existing working groups along the 17 SDGs that we are having to really promote these conversations and ensure that we build critical collaborations? And of course, multi-stakeholder dialogues. These are some of the things that we are doing as EAPN to really ensure that we have funding priorities, to ensure that we have regulatory frameworks, to ensure that we have corporate investment strategies that are aligned with the development goals of this continent. For example, we have worked around strengthening the PPPs that Maxi and colleagues mentioned earlier, and we are now in advanced stages on developing and disseminating that framework. And we hope that it's a model that will allow philanthropy to de-risk private investments, that will ensure that, that social impact remains a priority. The second thing, we have to reshape financial structures to future-proof philanthropy. I think that is what we really need to look into. And as the donor funding, the aid that we are looking at declines, Africa as a continent, East Africa as a region, must rethink how capital flows within the ecosystem. And EAPN, we are advocating for financial sustainability models that ensures that philanthropy moves beyond short-term grants to long-term engagements and investments. And again, investments that are based on financing structures. And so that is one of the other things that we are doing. And so we have to champion new capital mobilization strategies. I think looking at where we are at the moment as EAPN, we are looking at it as an opportunity. And so social impact bonds, for example, which tie funding to measurable outcomes, are some of the things that we really attract, private sector, local, ultra high net worth individuals, a lot of these bilateral agencies. If you look at the US, they are not just canceling aid, but they are saying that any partner that must partner with us as the US, and a lot of these foreign entities that we are talking about, must make them prosperous, must make them safe. And if we talk about those two, then we have to tie it to business. And so our connection as a sector with the private sector must be strategic. And lastly, because I know time is not on our end and we have additional speakers, as EAPN, we want to see how we can strengthen the resilience and the capacity of African philanthropy. We want to see how we can have the future of Africa that depends on strong institutions that are resilient, that are transparent, that are adaptive to the challenges that we are seeing at the moment. And as EAPN, we are actively working to enhance the governance structures, the governance frameworks of the institutions that we are having, accountability mechanisms being put in place by these institutions so that we can attract resources from the public while talking about unlocking domestic resources. And so again, through research, again, through peer learning networks, technical assistance, we are strengthening access to latest tools, we are strengthening our knowledge base, and we are strengthening the sharing and adoption of best practices to navigate the disruptions that we are seeing at the moment in the space. And so Maxi and colleagues, friends, delegates, those are some of the things that I feel will take us above where we are. And to sum it up in a sentence or so, we have enough resources as a continent to support our development agenda. We've got to just be accountable, eradicate duplication within the sector. At the national level and at the regional level, continental level, we have to boldly now talk about corruption, which is a menace in this continent. And then with reallocation of resources to priorities, we will be able to support and build a sustainable continent in terms of development. And that is what we want to see. Thank you so much, Maxi. Back to you.
Thank you, Evans. I am sure even the rest of the guests are like, yes, that was indeed an opening remark. And we are glad to be collaborating with the EAPN for this particular edition of Last Thursdays, and also for the research that we recently conducted that Nicholas was talking about earlier, as well as the continuity of the private-public philanthropic partnership regional framework that we will be continuing to explore. So I know you're in South Africa, and your brother, who is also in South Africa or in the Southern Africa region, but at almost about to take a flight, Zikamai. I love your work a lot. You can move the slide to the next speaker. Your work at the intersection between justice, development, and human rights. This moment that we are in is particularly horrifying for the nexus between lobbying, civic liberty, diversity, inclusion, equity, and such initiatives. And the communities that we serve from that lens are particularly affected. And so my question to you, sir, the next slide, please, the one with Zikamai. My question to you, sir, is how now do we use the present moment, the present reality that we find ourselves in as a gift or as an entry point for better funding and partnerships, examples or frameworks that can especially promote justice and equity in development? And what can the existing human rights frameworks that have been at play for such a while teach us about rethinking partnerships in this sector and holding ourselves to what Evans is calling accountability. Over to you, sir. Nice to see you, and thank you for joining us even while at the airport.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. Yeah, these are difficult times, and I agree with Evans. You know, sometime later last year, Evans and I were on a panel at the Africa Philanthropy Network conference in Vic Falls, and we were speaking about these things. How do we, as Africa, you know, rekindle our own capacities to drive development? And congratulations to the East Africa Philanthropy Network and Development Dynamics for providing the leadership necessary in these difficult times for our communities, for ourselves. And I think this meeting and the products that you are showing, that you are sharing in this meeting, they are evidence of your leadership, a leadership which the continent needs. So thank you and congratulations for that. Yeah, it's a tough question, that you have presented there. And as I was listening to you speaking, the keywords that were jumping at me. One, you say, how do we use this present moment as a gift, an entry point? And you are reminding us that this could actually be a blessing in disguise. As we know, sometimes tough situations like this, they come with them, you know, opportunities. It is said human beings don't like the pain of changing until the pain of not changing is more than the pain of changing. So I have a few thoughts that I could share, and I'm glad Evans has set the background for some of them. But also, like you mentioned in your remarks, I think the first thing that I would want to say is solidarity. The statistics that you have just showed us of what has happened to the sector because of the shifting global priorities. It's a catastrophe, it's an atrocity, and it's painful. There's blood on the floor for many of our brothers and sisters on both sides of the partnerships. So allow me at this point in time to offer my solidarity to many communities that are being affected by these shifts, and to also give them the space to process whatever they are going through. So that's the first thing that I would want to share. The second thing is, of course, you know, leadership now with an exclamation mark. You see, the problem, Eric, with leadership is that in as much as we need a lot of time to process the sufferings that we will be going through, it does not give us the luxury of doing that forever. So we might need to immediately, you know, deal with our pain, but get back to work and get things done. So I see this moment as a moment for African leadership to rise. And I have already mentioned the work that you are doing at Development Dynamics, East Africa Philanthropy Network, which I would call leadership now, leadership in the moment. There are decisions that need to be made. So there are many leaders who are confronted with these decisions. And I think it's a moment to lead with compassion. I said this at another conversation, and one of my colleagues later said to me, "Oh, you are preaching empathy philosophy. It doesn't work." I want to unpack that a little bit to say, you see, the sector that we are talking about, the development sector that we are talking about, is a sector that deals with the common good, and how we respond to crisis moments like this defines who we are as a people. And when we speak about leading with compassion, we are speaking about leaders who are in positions where they have to make difficult decisions. Sometimes they have to terminate contracts because the funds are just not there. And this is the time that I'm saying, I think as leaders, we have to lead with compassion. We have to understand the decisions that we are making. Just to give you an example, our organization is one of the organizations that was affected by this funding tsunami. we could have had an opportunity to say everyone who was on that grant can go home. But we decided we will carry the burden together. Everyone stays. It's an example of leading with compassion in action. So when I invite leaders who are faced with this crisis to lead with compassion, we are building a block to one of the 3 pillars of sustainability, which is leadership development. So let me unpack that a little bit. There is actually a research that was published in the Harvard Business Review that looks at leading with compassion. And I need to mention that this principle is not a crisis response. It's a way of leading, whether in plant or in want. So to quote from that report, the writers say, while compensation and benefits are an important part of retaining employees, the source of lasting loyalty to an organization is typically something deeper. It's typically something deeper. So the research then goes on to explore what exactly do we mean when we say compassion, and it gives us a definition. It's empathy plus action equals compassion. So compassion is the empathy in action. And I'm saying this is not a crisis response. It's a culture that we must build, whether we are in plant or in want. And it contributes to an important pillar of sustainability. Many organizations struggle with attracting talent. So that's an important area that I thought I should emphasize to leaders who are dealing. But of course, how you implement this in your own context, it differs. And sometimes you will need to make the critical decisions. Sometimes people will need to go home. And I've emphasized that you need to do this, the way you communicate, the way you handle this, as to show our way of leading as the development sector. And from here, where do we go? What does the gift invite us to do? Indeed, it invites us to make some of the tough choices. And one of the things is the work that you are already doing at Development Dynamics, building communities of support, knowledge, and solidarity. I think we need that as we grapple with this crisis. Leadership can be a lonely space for people who are running organizations that are affected. So it's important for us to begin to map out where are the spaces that we can come together to vent sometimes, to share knowledge, to share tools. And I invite leaders to take advantage of these platforms, the knowledge products that are being produced, and also use these opportunities to share solidarity. I have always said that we who are in the human rights sector, the people, we have no one but ourselves. The billionaires are armed with the military on their side, the money on their side. The people have no one but each other. And this is the time that we need to converge on the public square and share that knowledge. In the 4th area, we need to begin to take steps towards resilience and sustainability. And I'm glad Evans managed to unpack that for us. And I reduced that to a number of pillars. So the first one, we need to acknowledge this is the moment. It's a gift for us. It's a blessing in disguise. This is the moment. Stronger relationships are built in the dry season. So we begin to look around who understands our mission critical as a movement, as an organization, as an institution. And let's do that mapping exercise and begin the conversations so that these, our partners, can fill in the urgent gaps where we make a long-term plan. So these things that I have mentioned are the things that I think as we take advantage of this moment, we need to do in the short term. But in the long term, we need now to be asking, what does an effective sustainability plan look like in concrete terms? And I offer 3 pillars of what I think is an important, effective sustainability plan. Evans addressed one of them, community philanthropy. Now, we have been talking about community philanthropy for a long time. And now I'm saying if we never believed it, Maybe it's because we had the luxury not to. Now we have no options. We need to begin to find those spaces to build community philanthropy. And someone said to me, but community philanthropy is an ocean in a drop for what we need. Maybe it's because we had the luxury to think and live beyond our means. But now we have an opportunity. We need to begin to be looking at that principle of frugality as an organization. Do we need all those 4x4s? Do we need all those other things, or we now need to be limiting ourselves to what we actually need and begin to build community philanthropy? And it's not interventions that are out of this world. Just to give you a simple example. Sometime last year, our neighbor, who are a hotel in an organization that I work for, came to us and installed a borehole for us. And we spent the whole year getting free water. And we never sat down to realize that how many such simple relationships can we build for our movement. And when we got to the end of the year, I was saying to the colleagues, how do we multiply such initiatives? How do we acknowledge the work that they are doing with our organization? A simple thing, why is their name not appearing in our financial statements? They're a major contributor. And if we begin to do that, we begin to cultivate cultures of local community philanthropy. The second pillar is leadership development. Remember, I spoke about the way we lead as contributing to a pillar of sustainability. This is the pillar, leadership development. Because as John Maxwell says, everything rises and falls on leadership. And this is the moment to summon that resilience that we need to have been building in leaders. And when you drill deep down around leadership development, we have been saying time and again that Africa is not poor. It's poorly led. Believe me, it does not simply apply to government. It applies to all sectors. And this is the time for us to begin to map what is the role of leadership is navigating our path outside this crisis. And the third pillar is impact investments. When we begin to speak about what our organizations really need, some of us who come from people movements, we know that our capacity to organize is severely affected, not just by funding, but sometimes by legislative frameworks. And we are saying if we are going to invest in impact investments, in buildings, in infrastructure, Evans mentioned, the message that we are saying to our communities is that we are here to stay. We are not at a bus stop. We are here to stay. So if we are serious about sustainability, we must be looking at real impact investments. I happen to work for an organization that was built some 32 years ago. And one of the things that I've always been grateful for is that no matter how dry the past is going to be, we will always have accommodation. And the space will always be there for our members to come and organize. And we are there to stay, no matter what happens. And 33 years of organizing, of grassroots organizing, have proven to our predecessors that that investment, which they did many decades ago, has contributed to our sustainability today. And the fourth pillar is long-term, flexible, responsible partnerships. I have framed it as such because this is the time to begin to be speaking with those partners who have remained. You are looking, I've seen a list of many other donors that are shifting priorities. Just to give an example, I saw one for the Netherlands, and they've outlined what I think could be a reasonable withdrawal approach. And we begin to be evaluating the partnerships that we have. What does a responsible partnership look like? We need to be looking at those agreements, and that is very important. And to your second question, the human rights frameworks, quickly, Eric. The first thing that I want to offer is that it's a moment to realize that the primary duty bearer in ensuring citizens enjoy their rights is the government of the day. We, as development partners, can only complement their efforts, but we should never replace governments. And over the years of what Dambisa Moyo calls dead aid, we have learned to be complacent as a people. We have learned to let our governments get away in spaces where they need to be accountable. They are now buying luxury things, living luxurious lives, because our entire healthcare rests on the budget of a foreign government. And now it's time for us to pull up our socks as citizens and say they need to be more involved. The second thing is principles of good governance. National sovereignty demand that communities must actively lead in creating and sustaining their communities. This is true for governments, but it is also true for nonprofits. And it's an opportunity for us to begin to see, as we design new sustainability strategies, what is the place for communities? What is the place for local philanthropy? And then the place for international aid remains. I don't want that point to be lost as we hold our governments to account. The place for international aid remains. This is because of the humanity-based principle that to whom much is given, much is expected. To whom much is given, much is expected. Solving global challenges belongs to the global community. And we as global citizens, we remain very much alert that problems like disease, poverty, war, those are global problems. As a result, there is still space for international development aid, and we still continue to build solidarity as global citizens, bearing in mind the words of Nelson Mandela, who said, overcoming poverty is not an act of charity. It is an act of justice. Finally, let me say, where is African philanthropy? There's a latest report produced by Mo Ibrahim, where he calls us to order. He says our continent must stop squandering its own assets and take proper ownership and responsibility. He goes on to say, in short, we must apply good governance to ensure these assets are adequately leveraged for the best interests of our people. And many African leaders have said, what Africa needs is not development aid, but fair trade and investment. So that's the human rights lens that we bring to this conversation. But finally, I think this is a moment for us, as I have said before, to step a level higher from looking at ourselves as leaders of our small villages, small communities, small organizations, and become global citizens again and engage the much deeper, higher questions around development aid and begin to shape more sustainable solutions. And I congratulate Development Dynamics, East Africa Philanthropy Network, and many other comrades out there who are leading this conversation. Back to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your very wonderful insights. I encourage you, I know you have to catch a flight within the hour, but before you leave and also before Evans leaves, please feel free to interact in the chat section. There's some wonderful comments that are coming through from your wonderful insights that you're sharing. And I also request the rest of us to just feel free to engage, interact. There is a document that has been shared there where we can also post particular needs that we have. And I think there are needs arising a lot around leadership capacity, which is one of the things that is easily removed when it comes to funding opportunities. There is lots of opportunities that have been shared there in regards to potential fellowships, potential scholarships, potential grants. So there are those who are making a difference right now. And what Rashid has just shared there, we encourage you to go through it. And at this point, I'd like to bring Nadia in to the conversation. And I know that we have discussed numerous times with you that first of all, that I really love the incredible work that you're doing to support the cooperative, community-led partnerships at the heart of blood and water. And when you spoke recently, you mentioned that you've evaluated how your own grantees are being impacted, but most importantly, how they are adjusting. So in the spirit of this conversation, I'll just first ask you one question and then we all can get into the flow fast. So how do we as a sector ensure that the partnerships that you're talking about, they can be long lasting, they can be equitable, and they can be effective given the kind of donor fatigue, but also the disruptions that we are seeing across the sector, and what is the kind of work that you're doing. What kind of insights are you harvesting from the kind of work that you're doing alongside your collaborators? Nadia from Bloodwater, welcome so much.
Thank you so much, Maxi. Just also confirming if you can hear me okay.
Loud and clear.
Great. I am so encouraged by this conversation. This is by far, of all of the many conversations that I've been a part of, and I'm sure everyone who's attending today have been a part of, I am feeling a resounding echo of hope and self-determination that has been absent in a lot of spaces. And so I really do hope that this is a conversation that goes far and wide beyond just our convening today. Thank you so much for hosting it, Development Dynamics, and also EAPN. I'm so grateful even just for the opportunity to share our experience and even just to speak to this particular questions about how do we forge partnerships that are long lasting and that are truly equitable. I think just to maybe a starting place would be just for those in the room who maybe are not familiar with Bloodwater. We're an organization that partners with community and African-led organizations in Eastern and Southern Africa that are responding to health disparities in their communities. And we do that through a partnership model that pairs multi-year funding with organizational strengthening investments. So a lot of the work that we do and a lot of the spaces that we have the honor of speaking in and collaborating with peers is around this, how do we look at partnerships through the lens of equity and through the lens of sustainability. And so I think the first part of the question, which is so good, how do we ensure that partnerships last? I am going to kind of turn that on its head, if you don't mind. I think it's really important for all of us to approach partnerships with the lens and the mindset that partnerships end. And when you hold that from the start, then it changes the whole perspective of what partnerships exist to be, how they can catalyze the existing autonomous efforts of an organization that's working in communities, or let's just say frontline organizations across various sectors, whose work was there before a partnership began and whose work will be there after the partnership ends. And if we hold that as the mindset, it gives us a whole different frame of reference to engage. That there is a season of time with which partnerships exist and come together around the interests and the vision of the organizations that are doing the work on the ground. And that should be the starting point for all partnership conversations. I think what's really important is also just to echo what's already been said. I think Evans just set us up so well to consider just as a sector how diverse the different players are. And that when we think about the diversity, whether it's the size and scope of resources, the sectors of interest, the type of organizational or institutional frameworks that exist, whether it's private philanthropy, private sector, different kinds of financing options, even holding development partnerships still as a player in the ecosystem, that when we think about the diversity of those of us, organizations that do have the ability to position private philanthropy in the hands of organizations that are working in communities all across the continent, we get to think about how can we organize in a way to create longevity, so that in as much as all of us probably have, very specific timeframes with which a partnership can exist, that we do it in a way that creates a pipeline of funding possibility for any organization, and that there would be continuity. But I still hold what the other speakers have said, that those partnerships cannot exist even in a time-bound, even with a time-bound lens. They cannot exist outside of the context of the organization's autonomy and existence outside of the partnership, so that everything that happens within that time frame is advancing the interests of and the future of that individual organization or a cohort of organizations with longevity beyond the partnership. So I do think it is important to start. And what even was just spoken by Zikamai is that responsible partnership are partnerships that plan for transitions and for ends. That responsibility is also a really important part of going to the second part of your question about how do we make these partnerships equitable. That is a part of equity. It's not just about the coming to the table as peers and making sure that the terms are mutual, that the interests have mutual, if not more of a skew for the partner themselves, the one that is receiving the investment and is doing the work, but that it is also clear that the parameters are clearly defined, and that where there are ends or transitions that are necessary, that they are planned with the organizations leading in terms of what would be best and what, again, sets them up to continue to do the work irrespective of that one partnership that is looking at exiting. I also want to say that I think that it's important for us in this moment just to kind of echo again on the importance of this as a gift, seeing it as a moment that we can remember that not all partnerships are equal. That is an inherent design of some mechanisms. And I think as a sector, we would be foolish or naive to think that equity is by design the intention of some of the frameworks for development. And so it matters that the ones that are known, are scaled, that the ones that have the ability to even operate within those parameters, that we do that and we make that the norm. But the ones that are not engaged with an expectation to be anything beyond what they are. And I say this particularly around bilateral mechanisms. That's not a criticism, that is just a reality. They have inbuilt political drivers that influence things like stability, continuity, even the autonomy of the organizations that are receiving the funding. So I think we have to really see the trend that's happening of bilateral investments reducing or shifting away from the continent, not as something that, again, is, and there is great loss, there is great irresponsibility in the way in which some of these things are happening. But it is indeed a gift, because then what it allows is for the ecosystem to actually build in and up from what is remaining the norms and the standards that have been a part of movements that we have all been championing for the last 5 to 10 years, some of us, even before that, around shifting power so that the entire parameters of partnerships in development spaces can be based on the organizations that are doing the work being the ones with the upper hand. I think equity will be a norm when the communities and the organizations that are born out of them actually make that the standard by which we, partners of different types and sizes and countries of origin, then get to engage with. I think that demand-driven standards approach is a necessity. I think that this is an opportunity to harness that, and that it's the mindset also that we need to hold, that development partners get to be a part of the work that is already happening in communities. And I think just to share some of the experiences that we're seeing amongst our partners who have been brutally impacted by the shutdown, particularly partners that are working in the HIV space, which is missional to us. PEPFAR being one of the few of all the sectors that have been ravaged. HIV is one that uniquely has an irreversible damage that happens with even the smallest window of time of interruption of funding. What we saw, and I just want to maybe end on this point, is that our partners received, some of them, the stop work orders. They were given orders to notify their staff that they needed to go home. And the very next day, community health workers, nurses, counselors, clinical officers, they all reported to work, because this work is going to continue irrespective of where the funding is coming from. And it will continue irrespective of if the funding returns. And my hope is actually that when it does, because I believe it will, I believe that even with the changing of tides, that there will always be a form in which development, foreign assistance or foreign aid is going to try to find a place. I hope that we as an ecosystem, and most notably the partners that have been impacted by this change, would remember this moment and set a completely different standard of what would be acceptable modes of engagement, so that never again would something like this happen in this way.
We are completely shifting the tides. Thank you, Nadia. In our consulting work, we have challenged some of the people who do some incredibly good work to call for a proposal to funders and not wait for the reverse, to organize themselves and package what the amazing work that they're doing and say, hey, this is our call for proposal for funders to come and partner with us. I think those are the kind of models that we need to begin seeing more of, so that there is community leadership and a sense of ownership and a complete shift of tides. At times, the ones with the resources do not know where the shoe pinches the most. And therefore, it is a time for us to take our collective power, if we are investees and change makers, as much as it is a time for us to change and approach funding and how we give differently if we are investees, if we are investors, sorry. And so thank you, Nadia, for your remarks. There's some nice questions for you coming, one from Becky and another one from Joe Zaremba. And at this point, I would just love to introduce Eunice. I've been seeing you scratching your head and thinking, oh my God, yes, this is resonating pretty much, because especially of the work that you do, leading community-owned development at the ground level and scaling the Rwandan, the Alight in Rwanda, but thinking about organizational adaptation in the face of the realities that we now currently face, some of which require NGOs and INGOs to raise up to, if not more than 50% of income independently, up from, you know, where it used to be before, maybe 25% or less, so so that they can receive grants. So how now do we ensure that we can survive and thrive and continue to deliver more impact on the ground, given the sort of disruptions that we are seeing? And what strategies do you see working to win us off from this aid dependency to local sustainable solutions? Joining us from Rwanda today, right? Yes, yes. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Maxi and colleagues, for this very insightful conversation that we're having today. I want to start by just giving hope that indeed, yes, we shall survive. Maybe not in the shape and form that we exist today, but we will definitely survive. Now, a couple of things that I thought maybe before we embark on how we shall survive, and also to introduce the kind of work that we do in Rwanda. So Alight works with displaced persons in Rwanda and host communities to look for what we call abundance. And we have been using interesting perspectives such as co-creation, working with the communities, building community structures, and also strengthening the resilience of the displaced persons. And we're talking about refugees and host communities in about 5 refugee camps. Now, one thing that comes to mind, and coming from an NGO perspective, is that we have to have a mindset shift. The bus has left the station, definitely. And this bus didn't just leave the station today. The bus actually left the station a couple of years ago. We started to experience funding disruptions maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when, you know, there was a big shift in terms of how donors wanted to prioritize where they wanted to fund. And that brings me to the fact that we need to think like business people. We in the humanitarian sector are not accustomed to think like businessmen. But I think the time is now that we need to think more as business people. We need to move from charity to investments. We have been thinking about giving people assistance for free, even when we don't really look deep in terms of what is the contribution they may have to the kind of assistance that we are giving to them. I think now we have been pushed to think in this direction. We must think like business people. We must think like investors, even though we are providing humanitarian assistance to vulnerable people. One of the key values that I really love in Alight highlights that every human being has the capacity to contribute in one shape or form to the kind of life that they would want to live. And so I think it's very important for us to tap into what the communities have to bring on board. I want to bring in also another notion of we pride ourselves as, organizations that work in multiple countries, in multiple sectors. And I think we are getting to a point where we want to see that size does not really mean relevance. Being able to work in 40 countries, implementing a myriad of interventions and sectors might not be what is at stake at the moment. And I think we need to start thinking about prioritizing, including geographic prioritization of areas of investment that we want to have. And that's very critical because, as Zikamai mentioned, there are painful decisions that we have to make as leaders, including having to drop geographic regions where there's duplication of efforts, or having to drop geographic regions where the investment is simply not making business sense. And this is something that I think is very soon going to find us. I want to talk, Eric, about this, this situation that we find ourselves, which is very vulnerable. We as Africans have, as other speakers have mentioned, we are not poor. Probably the resources we have not been very well managed, but we are not poor. We have already seen some countries that have already started to think ahead about how they can be more self-reliant and less dependent on aid. I'll take an example of the country that I'm sitting right now, which is in Rwanda, which has a very interesting perspective about how development has been. If you have been following the developments lately, you will see that Rwanda doesn't really sell poverty. And I think this is something that we need to adopt as international organizations in order for us to survive. Rwanda sells abundance. Rwanda sells thriving. Rwanda sells economic opportunities. Rwanda sells amazing opportunities that you can get from here. I don't remember the last time I saw a malnourished child being pictured from Rwanda, because this is not the picture they want to portray for themselves. And I think we as humanitarian organizations, we need to put on the table, what is it that we are going to bring on board? What impact are we going to make? Because that era of selling poverty and scarcity is probably behind us right now. And we need to catch up with the times and what needs to happen. We are talking about models that have worked, and I wanted to just think about which African country has actually been able to implement some of these models, particularly in the Eastern and Southern Africa. And I actually saw that, for example, in Botswana, they've been able to sell their diamonds and invest in infrastructure, in health, and in education, things that we are talking about today. How can we support the governments that we are working with for them to be able to deliver without necessarily having going to the global West? Africa alone, 60% of our land that is cultivatable is not cultivated, or it's not being used, while we are spending billions of money importing food. How about climate smart agriculture? How can we invest in that in a manner in which we will be food secure? How can we negotiate better for fair trade terms? We export a lot of coffee that is raw, and we buy it again when it comes back to our lands after it has been processed. How can we have fair trade on investment so that the communities that we are serving can actually benefit from what we are talking about? How can we make advantage of the carbon credits markets? Because we all know that Africa contributes the least when it comes to global emissions. Has any of us here really engaged in getting carbon credits? And so we need to think investment. We need to think beyond exporting minerals as a nation, as a continent. We need to think about what is the value addition we can have with the resources that we have right now. Another thing that I think we, and when I say we, it also includes myself and my organization that I'm representing here. It is time for us to look at to map assets, not necessarily to do needs assessments that really just portray what needs are there. Can we start mapping what assets are actually there? Because the communities that we are serving are invested heavily on a lot of assets that we could also benefit from. What is the impact that we have made so far? How much more do we talk about, the number of people or the number of children who've been saved from HIV infections because of the interventions that we have? So we need to speak loudly to the people who can listen so that we can actually communicate better on the impact that we are making. We really have a space. We have a space to contribute to building and thriving organizations amidst these funding disruptions. I thought of a couple of practical points of what we can do. And I'm speaking from an NGO perspective because this is where I sit most of the time. And coming from an NGO that is, of course, American by its headquarters, we've been heavily impacted on the changes that have happened recently. One of the key things that we may need to consider is how we could actually go to non-traditional funding donors, such as the Gulf, such as BRICS nations, such as regional philanthropists, and even in-country philanthropists, so that we can diversify our donor base. This is something that we need to start considering right immediately. We cannot underscore the need for the private sector partnerships. We have seen not only the CSR, which contributes maybe 0.0 something percent of what companies actually have to give back to the communities. We need to look at more than that. It's more than the CSR. It is looking deeper into having a partnership with the private sector to maybe take back some of the things that have fallen in the cracks, them contributing to education, contributing to health, contributing to water and sanitation. So finding partnerships that can actually impact on the communities that we have been serving so far. One of the key resources we have in this sector is the diaspora. Many of us are working out of our own countries, but we are very part and parcel of the communities where we come from. How much more do we contribute? Apart from the savings and credit chamas that we normally belong to, how can we be contributing to the education in our own localities? How can the diaspora actually make a meaningful contribution to the development and the humanitarian assistance that our communities back at home require? We also need to look, I will not talk into the blended financing models that previous speakers have talked about, but I also wanted to talk about localization. These particular changes that we have seen right now really require us to cut on costs. It is time for us to think about not investing heavily on travels and, miles and miles of travel, but really working with the local community who really have the local solutions at hand. And also being able to implement cost-effective digital solutions, like, for example, telemedicine, where we are not able to reach to communities that are far away from us. AI-driven data collection, using digital means for us to really be able to get to communities that we definitely want to support. And I also want to say having adaptive programming, interventions that, that are based on funding availability, and scalable programs that can be scaled into, bigger programs. So these are some of the modalities I think we will survive if we are able to implement. Just to touch a little bit about the fact, one of the speakers actually spoke about us not being able to replace governments. In fact, the government being the duty bearer, we maybe have shifted a little bit and took a lot from their pocket. It is time that we work with the governments to ensure that the communities get the assistance that they require. They are the ultimate duty bearers. And when all this funding collapses and, it shifts a lot, they are the ones who bear the brunt of having to ensure that the health center is operational, the school is open. And therefore, there's never a better time like now that we need to work with the governments in place to make sure they are more accountable. They are, providing the services that they're supposed to provide. But most of all, also, I mean, instead of going to the West, how about if we also explored South to South collaborations where, the global South governments can also have partnerships that can ensure that those that are more endowed, I like what Zikimai said, that to whom much is given, much is expected. And we know that this platform was not balanced from the very beginning. A lot of the funding that we have been receiving is actually based on colonialism and neo-colonialism, funding models that are not sustainable. But I think within the African nations, from nation to nation, there is a lot that we can borrow from one another. There's a lot that we can learn from one another. And so we need to wean ourselves from dependency to aid, as we also establish a mechanism where international players and international NGOs can still have a place to contribute to reinforce and strengthen what community initiatives have been put in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Eunice. And you reiterate something very important in this entire dialogue: mental models, like a shift, complete shift of how we have been doing things. And at the heart of all of this is people who, yes, there are communities that are impacted, there are organizations that are impacted, but then also there are individuals, practitioners like you and I who are here today, and a few who are actually in this call, whose jobs are no longer there, who have to worry about how to pay mortgage, how to pay school fees, how to pay rent, and how to just live the next day, let alone just the communities. One of our clients was speaking to me and they said, yes, they're really wearing the heart of the people they serve a lot, but at some point that will break them and they need now to wear the heart of what do I need to survive. Greg, you've been telling wonderful stories, wonderful personal stories and testimonials about coping at an individual level with things like layoffs and right sizing that result from aid shifts. What kind of responses are you receiving from your audiences in terms of that which resonates the most as tips for those who are affected and wondering how to adapt at an individual level to a new, hopefully temporary normal? Greg, I welcome you to the conversation. And I'm sure you're probably somewhere in the deep villages.
No, I made it back to the city. So thank you so much for having me. And good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, good friends, old, new friends. It's so good to see all of you. And thanks, Development Dynamics, for convening this very timely conversation. I honor those that have spoken before me and shared a lot of insights, very useful. I acknowledge this is a moment that requires a lot of empathy, that requires a lot of hope, that requires a lot of care and solidarity, across the globe, because these problems are not individual, they are collective, and they bite both, both the individuals and the communities and the people that we are surrounded. As you know, from the African perspective, we rely on the idea that I am because we are. So when one tree falls, it's a whole village that is affected. So I've been running a series of articles reflecting on layoffs and what that exactly means. And these are partly sharing my personal experience after having experienced two layoffs out of, as we call it, a cycle of funding has ended and therefore people have to leave. And then all the development priorities have changed, the strategy has shifted, and therefore certain department needs to be put on redundancy because an organization needs to move into dealing with AI because that is a new challenge, or even the most radical that we're now experiencing, which is the USAID stop. And the series of articles has been really just narrating and asking deeper questions. And I'll share a link to for people to subscribe at the end of this conversation, has been really to ask deeper questions on how did we find ourselves here. And Maxi, you asked me what is resonating the most. And really what is resonating the most is actually people wanting to go back to ask themselves deeper questions about how did we get here and how do we rebuild our power. One of the things that happened in a moment of, this was the end of 2013, not 2013, 2023, when, our department was put on redundancy on conversations that the strategy was shifting. And this is, a philanthropy that had a lot of financing to actually do much more things. But decided simply AI is the new thing, then the aid should shift in that particular direction. And my deeper question was like, so what remains of the many things that we've set up, the organizations that we've been working with, that have been working on areas of social justice, isn't social justice connected to AI and all that, but they wouldn't listen and proceeded with that. And after stepping out of that ecosystem, I asked myself, like, what was the first point that I engaged myself in the development work and went deep into academia and deep into research and to understand what is the concept of development. And the articles that resonate with the people are those that ask them deep questions such as, what am I? Without the jobs, without the titles that you've accumulated across the 20 years of working in development aid. One day you were program officer for this and that. Now you're a specialist and an expert in this kind of thing. Like when you strip all that, then what really becomes the person that remains? What does that person stand for? And to find these answers, I went back to when I was 12 years old, when I was running a school campaign program on nutrition. Just armed with three simple things: music, dance, and drama, and just a guide on how to create music for the villages. And there was no external funding for anything, but like the programs that we created resonated so much. And by asking that question and going back that far, it came back to me asking, so then what has happened over those last 20 years? And realize that we have been captured in a system which I would otherwise call the non-profit industrial complex. And I'll share a book that, if you want to expand your understanding, you can look at it. It's called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. That we've evolved over a long period of time to a point where what we are caught up in is what you'd otherwise now call a non-profit industrial complex, where big philanthropies and organizations, in their quest for avoiding to pay tax, will channel money in the global south. But this money is never really supposed to solve the problem fully. It really creates do-goodism culture. It really creates an environment where people are busy and creating more literature and more conferences and more conversations, but really it cannot challenge the systemic challenges, the systemic issues that we've found ourselves caught in. And it also led me to reflecting around how did we lose power as communities? And as it led me to reflecting around how, the cooperative movement has died its natural death, the emergence of individualism and, and the culture of personas, like people and celebrities and how organizing at community level, even the definition of community level, has become such a problematic thing because it's no longer geographically, and how technology has come into the middle of the concept of sharing right now, where we have a shared economy, which revolves around using Uber or using Airbnb to like mediate our capabilities, and just how our concept of community has been weakened by globalization, but also beyond that, it has also been weakened by governments that do not put priorities on our own development or help us define development for our own selves, where public participation is basically an opportunity to tick boxes, just tick boxes. Public participation is tick boxes rather than really provide the necessary advice that is required. And it also led me to the idea that, deeply understanding and interrogating the idea that development is political, as it's framed today, it's political. What else that should not be the way it is perceived. And so I asked deeply whether a lot of our communities we work with and the people we serve really understand how political development aid is, for example, and whether by communities not being able to understand that deeply, they've been caught up in this industrial complex where they do not really understand where to go. So that gives a background of how I came up to start to write this series of articles, and I need to continue to write them because the frame of mind that is emerging in terms of how this resonates is like, so how can we rebuild our collective power? How can we build community power? And I've heard the speakers that have come before me emphasize that now the power lies in the community and community organizing and recalibrating, local philanthropy and all that. But like, how do we seriously get back to where development, just the way we define democracy as being a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and that kind of stuff, where we are defining development as an act of progress for the people, by the people, as an act of them prioritizing what their needs and looking for models that can work, both in terms of financing, but also in terms of really executing the progress that they look forward to. And looking at how do we study deeply models that have worked from across this continent that did not need external financing that we can utilize to really prop communities forward. And now, as I conclude this, one of the things that I've been asked to talk about is like, how is the creative community managing it? And I looked at before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID, and one of the organizations where I am a director of strategy and sustainability is called Suntory East Africa. And we work in music. And so we work in electronic music. And the idea around this is to help people that find in music hope and creativity to actually thrive. And our strategy currently is on leadership and livelihoods. And then we had a post-COVID boom of small grants on project financing, for creatives and that kind of work. But then beyond that, when we wrote a strategy and we knocked at the doors of very many funders, it was very clear that the environmental shift, there was no institutional grants, especially for the cultural and creative sector, which is often seen as more of entertainment rather than actually it plays a critical role in wellness and well-being of people. And so I called the team together and we sat down and asked them, like, what do you guys then think we should do? But before we do that, can we do a political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental scan of what is happening? And this was also happening exactly at the same time when the global funding shift. And in examining all the conversations, we came down to the conclusion that the power lies with the community. And the creative sector is self-organized in its own way, where you have what you call the mainstream and you have the underground. And the mainstream is what you see that is branded and hyped on billboards and all that kind of stuff. But there is another invisible community that people don't get to see, which is what we call underground. And in the underground community is where you find different communities have thrived by skills, swapping skills, exchange, but the barter system is still very evident there. Organizing music in venues that are more resonating to the needs of the community as opposed to feeding the capitalist machine. And so the tactics that could be borrowed from around the creative community and its set of organizing, for me, one is how do we support communities? How do we support the cottage culture, as I've called it and discussed, as I've discussed it with Maxi, as a shield against globalization? How do we, within the music sector, you will find that there are events that are owned and funded by the community, and they're organized with the very basic idea that all we need to do is to break even, but have a good opportunity of coming together and creating together. How do we enhance the culture of skill swap, of swapping goods, of swapping the things that we have at our own hand? And the second thing has been community organizing. And here on community organizing, the thinking is around how do we re-energize those communities to reprioritize themselves and capture, as what I said before, progress of the people, by the people, for the people. And lastly, the thinking around our strategy now is around social justice. While music plays a critical role in what we call art and activism and that kind of stuff, it is about organizing these communities for restorative social justice, which basically means giving back to ourselves that which has been taken away from us. So you will see within our communities people playing with traditional instruments, people getting more interested in folk music, people getting more interested in their own spirituality, and going further deep. I'm going further deeper into that. So I have a little one who's come here, but let me finish. So the idea, and for me, the bottom line has been how do we reorganize ourselves to get back our power and to rebuild from the scratch? And therefore, I'll share this book, The Nonprofit Industrial Complex. Please read it, and it might give you some tips on how we might see tomorrow with a better eye. Thank you very much, Maxi, and the team for inviting me for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. And thank you also for the resources that you're sharing. And I request and encourage as everyone, the panelists, the participants, everyone who's on call, if you can share resources like that, please drop them on the chat section. We will organize them in that community dashboard that we are creating, and we will share all of this with you. And I cannot imagine how time has flown so fast, as it often does when you engage in something enjoyable. This has been a very fantastic conversation. Thank you all for spending your time, your afternoon or evening with us in what continues to be undoubtedly the most important conversation we can have in the region currently. It's a rich and meaningful session that you've just had. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, moderators. Thank you to our partners, EAPN, and thank you to the very hardworking Development Dynamics team that has been behind the scenes and working tirelessly to organize this 12th edition, and amidst many adaptations and many iterations that we've had to do. So I'd like us to end here on a note of hope that we have collected together, but also on a note of systemic change, which is impossible. Jacqueline.
Yes.
Where are you? I've been looking for you, Jacqueline.
No, but I've been here all the while.
I didn't cut you short because I wanted to. I was only I couldn't trace you, and I asked around if you're around. So where are you? I can't still see you.
But can I request? Also understand that we are ending. So, but yeah, I was like, I've been here the whole time.
Oh, I genuinely, I still can't trace you on screen. I can see Kevin looking like it's Kevin speaking, so maybe there is an overlap. But allow me to request the audience to please, if you can and if you may, to extend for a little while. Yes, there you are, Jacqueline. I can see you. I can see you, Jacqueline, and really, really, really nice to see you. I was so ready for you. We have all been so ready for you. So really nice to see you. Thank you. Jacqueline works with, she's the CEO of SIPSOS Africa, and she works in across the continent to bridge traditional grant making with an African feminist feminist movement partner and localization strategy. So it's a very important conversation that that we should have. And so I know you are probably, having listened to everyone, you can agree that this is a wake-up call on what real localization and the journey towards self-resilience means. So with the kind of volatility that we are seeing, how do we rethink partnership to move beyond aid dependency and decolonize ourselves economically? And what else does your particular fund, CIFSOS Africa, and your grants advisory services also, how do you activate systemic change? How are you changing the mental models? That's why I started introducing it earlier, especially among investors and partners. And you can just spend a few minutes letting us know that the team has accepted that we'll stay behind, and we'll give you like some 5 or so minutes for this. Jacqueline, welcome.
Thank you. And you know, again, because I had to raise my hand, I totally know people are tired. We've been here for 2 hours. We need to stretch and do the things we do in the evenings in East Africa and wherever we are. So apologies. I will truly run through because I believe my colleagues have given us a plethora of ideas, which we just need to ruminate on. And I feel like what I wrote is almost looks like end notes to our, so let me be that student that doesn't answer the question, but only to say these 3 things, that even as I was thinking about this conversation and what I would like to say and what localization might look like going forward, self-reliance, I said we can respond in the following ways, right? We can hit the snooze button. And many of us do, right? It's like, time to wake up. And you're like, no, I'm still snoozing, right? Because that's an option. So to watch where we might be hitting that snooze button. And we might fall in the category of, you know, that alarm goes off and there are people who just shoot out of bed, right? They're like, get up, dress up, show up, right? Where's the action? What do we need to do? And some of us fall in that category. And
sorry, did I lose?
I'm
Jacqueline,
here
we can no longer
again.
hear you.
Oh, Lord.
All right. Oh, welcome.
I don't even know where you guys lost me, but I was saying yes, to, you know, for me to wind up and wrap up, 3 possible reactions: hit the snooze button, get up, dress up and show up, or keep wishing for what has been, right? There are people who live in the good old days, whatever that might look like. So I think for us on this call and in our communities, in our organizations, it's to sit down and say, where am I and where do I need to be? Because the alarm is ringing. In fact, it has been ringing. It just hasn't rung today. It has been ringing for the last several years. So
Oh, Jacqueline. Yes. Just confirm if you can hear Jacqueline. No? Okay.
Yeah, no, yeah.
All right. Jacqueline, sorry, it has shown that you hung. I was expecting to continue to hear you so much, because what you're sharing is remarkable, and you are challenging us on whether in this wake up time it is what our response will be, whether we will hit the snooze button. Sorry, I hope we do not, and I hope we see the frontier around private-public partnership, private-public philanthropic partnerships, private-public partnerships, to continue to benefit from what we, rather to continue being an opportunity for us to build and scale some of the work that we are doing. We need to move forward into the future and implement what we are hearing today. Today wasn't about talk, it was more about igniting action at an individual, at an institutional, but also at a systemic level. And we will convene again next month for the next edition of Last Thursdays, which will be on an important topic. If you can move to the slide that shows next month's topic. We will be discussing how do we really actually measure change? You know, how do we measure impact? Often we are all working towards impact, but we are probably not measuring it as we should. So the very last slide that shows the topic is that we will want to explore from a systems level, from the way we are discussing today as actors across the sector. How can we work together to measure impact? And that's a conversation that I'm inviting us to. If you can go 2 slides back. I wanted to end the conversation and the dialogue today to say, to ask you to stay tuned for more highlights of what the conversation has been today. I know we are pressed of time, but it's because the conversation itself is so timely, it's so rich and cannot quite end. So we are hoping that we've just ignited this conversation and it will continue from a different angle. So from across our DD social media, Liz will drop the link tree in the chat section. You are free to continue following the conversations, but also participating. And we are hoping to also partner with you in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th edition of Last Thursdays. Please remember to fill out the community crowdsourcing database that Mutile was sharing earlier, and that will also be put again. And until we see you again, allow me to bid you a good kwaheri, a good thank you so much. Feel free to stay across. The chat will be open. The webinar, so quote unquote, will not be closed until if you want to bond with someone, if you want to enter into the community database, we will spend a few additional minutes until at least 1:15, just letting you interact. If you have any important question that you want to ask, feel free to unmute. And if you have any point that you'd like to mention, please feel free to do so. But I want to end from the note, and you can go to the previous 2 slides, that as was mentioned at the beginning, Development Dynamics, we present ourselves as both as a tripartite, as a think tank, as a do tank, and as a through tank. And whatever happens next in this equation of what we are having the dialogue on today depends on where you fit in the ecosystem. And at this time of crisis, you could choose to be a partner, you could choose to be a collaborator, you could choose to be a litigator, a catalyst. I like one here that we call a stalker, who keeps their eyes and ears open to opportunities to take advantage of, because as we speak, you know, we say that never waste a crisis. That is the truth about what we are conversing today. Never really waste a crisis. Let us all consider where we may be, where we may advocate. We each have something we can do. We can mobilize, we can research, we can provide capital, we can facilitate dialogues of this nature, we can bring convenings together like what EAPN is doing at in June in Rwanda this year. We could build capacity of those ones who really are at the heart of change. So I request you to just think about how you can plug in. And if you'd like to explore a lot more of this, and you could move to the next slide, Development Dynamics can partner and collaborate with you to help you move from one level. Please, Nick, move to the next slide. We can help you move from one level of thought beyond just short-term strategies into medium, long-term, but most importantly, future flex strategies. We were talking earlier today about going beyond needs analysis and needs assessment into mapping assets. That's right up what we are doing, helping you move and navigate the data and the noise but use the opportunity, the present opportunity, to scan signals, to confront the present and the future with the plurality that it calls for, and to move beyond short-sighted answers into better questions that have a learning focus, and where we ask ourselves, how might we learn from this opportunity? Our contacts are shared on the last slide, which we will now go to. And if you would like to engage in any way, feel free to hit us an email at any one point, and engage us at any one of our channels. Kindly move to the last slide. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to continue interacting, to continue seeing some of the opportunities that have been drawn out in the community database, and also to continue to just reach out to the different people that you find in this community, not just development dynamics and EAPN, but any colleagues that you may have interacted with in today's conversation. There is a lot of nice resources that have been shared across, and we will take on all these resources and put them in that community database. And feel free to also continue. Feel free to also just continue interacting as you will. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will end my part. And now I just invite you to just comment, chat, drop off at any time that you want to. But if you want to remain behind, again, to catch up, to network, to ask a question, the link is open for the next 5 or so minutes, then we can continue sharing. Thank you for your time. This has been a remarkable conversation. This has been a sector-shaping, ecosystem-shifting kind of dialogue, and we are happy and honored to be the stewards of it, and we look forward to continuing to engage you again and again. Thank you so much.